Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate all of your attendance. Today's webinar is titled Leveraging Your LMS to Enhance Student Success. I'm Dan Thompson, and I'll be your host for today's event. And before we get started with today's presentation, I'm just going to knock out some logistics for everybody. First and foremost, today's presentation is being recorded. It'll be distributed to attendees after the event, more than likely within 24 hours. A few Zoom features to go over, which I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with the Zoom by now, but it can't hurt to go over these once more. The Q&A feature is for any questions that you may have for our presenter, Austin, today. I'll see them, I'll share them toward the end of the presentation. If it's topical, Austin has been gracious enough to let me interrupt him and ask him when the question is asked. The chat feature is for general inquiries, so feel free to post anything you'd like to share with the entire group there. Finally, we'd love for you to get social with today's event. We'll be tweeting using the hashtag #LunchWithLeo, which should be on each screen today. And so please follow along and participate. To do that, just go to the search bar in Twitter and type in #LunchWithLeo, and then click on latest, and it will show you all the tweets from today. We always think that we learn best as a community here, and we're always happy to hear your thoughts. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get to the main event, which is Austin Rutledge. So a little bit about Austin before I turn it over. With more than a decade of experience working in education, Austin is passionate about working to improve student outcomes at every level of education. Austin is taught at every level from middle school to university courses and has spent the last 4 years working alongside faculty in every possible setting from primary grade classrooms to medical school labs in an effort to increase student engagement and improve retention. While much of Austin's expertise lies in technology integration, his focus is always on finding the right pedagogical approach, regardless of the role technology may play. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to today's presenter, Austin Rutledge. Thanks, Austin.
Thanks, Dan. So, so just to kind of get our bearings about, what we're going to be focusing on today, I really like this idea of just a quick, lunchtime refresher on, ways that you can utilize your LMS to really help ensure that your students are being as successful as they can. So, two of the main things we're going to focus on today, two of my favorite topics when it comes to teaching and learning are reflection and feedback. And those do kind of go hand in hand. And you'll see, as we start to talk about those, that there is a lot of overlap between those two ideas. And then with regards to communication with students, we'll talk about some best practices and some ways that you can do that, thinking about how you can utilize your LMS to communicate with your students. And then finally, really just thinking about how do you provide access to the learning content for your students? What are you doing to make sure your students have access to whether it's slide decks or other forms of learning content that you provide for them. So without further ado, let's go on and talk about reflection. A lot of you, I know in my own teacher education program, Charles Dewey was a name that came up a lot. And, he's really well known for a lot of things, but I often see him quoted in thinking about reflection. And so the first part of this quote actually is that we don't learn from experience, we learn by reflecting. And that's the second part of this. We learn by reflecting on our experiences, as you see here. And I think that's so true, with regards to what we do. I mean, even just things that you do in your normal average daily life, oftentimes, there's a lot of, little things that you do here and there that aren't that big of a deal. But oftentimes when bigger things happen, when more important things happen, it's often important that we stop and we reflect on that. I know, I think about, my life as an educator. There have been a number of times where, after a class, I'll think to myself, that went not really the way I wanted it to. And so, taking the time to really ask myself, what was I trying to achieve? What about it went well or didn't go well? And then what am I going to do different next time? So really thinking about how reflection plays a key role. And it's not just important for faculty as educators, it's important for students to reflect on their learning too. It's a critical component. And so when I think about reflection, for me, it's really kind of this 3-part process. And so really that first step is really kind of understanding, your thought process through along the way. What was your thinking when you were either learning the new material, when you were, practicing or implementing some kind of new skill. So whether it's explicit or tacit knowledge, what was your thought process that you were utilizing in that learning? And then based on feedback, so we're going to get to feedback in just a second, but based on your feedback that you get from your, whether it's a quiz or a performance, you're practicing a skill, based on that feedback, how are you going to alter your understanding of that thought process? Or, maybe things didn't go as well as you expected, or maybe they went really well. So at that point in that second step, you're going to either choose to alter your thinking or confirm, that I really did get this. I know this, and I understand it. I've learned it, and I can now apply that information. And so that moves us on to step 3, which is really more of this metacognitive type of strategy, where students, they begin to think about ways that they can determine, those activities that really help them to, if things went really well and students were able to confirm their thinking, then they can look back at the ways that they studied or the activities they engaged in and think, okay, this really worked for me and I can utilize this approach again. Or if they determine that, something about this learning or this performance or this skill, this activity that I performed didn't go as well as I thought, maybe I need to change something. And so maybe I want to try studying a different way or try practicing this a different way. I think in an example in medical education that comes to mind in working with students at my previous institution, when students were learning to tie sutures, I often found out quickly that students, it's not something that they really ever get right the first time they do it. And so there's a lot of practice and a lot of repetition of that. And every time that they do it, they're thinking or learning to do something differently about that. And so, this really is a cyclical process. So once you determine which behaviors led to success, which didn't, now you know which ones to repeat or not repeat when you're back in the classroom again. And so another closely related concept is this idea of this reflective practice, kind of developed by Roth in the early 2000s. And this really gets into service learning approaches. And I know this is a big component of many medical schools out there. And, with the idea of you start with what. And so this is where you want to describe your experience. And so, what happened? What did I, what was this experience like? Describing it in detail. And then moving on to this idea of so what. And so this is where you're going to think about what was significant about this experience. So why was this experience important? What did I learn from this experience? What were the feelings that I had during this experience? And then finally, that last part of this reflective practice, thinking about, what are the next steps? Now what? And so what am I going to do moving forward? Am I going to continue to engage in this type of activity? And so I know because service learning is a important component in many medical education programs, I wanted to provide some ideas about reflection, not just that 3-step process, but even getting into how it can be more specific and practical for, specific parts of your curriculum. And so getting a little bit more practical now with, that this webinar, this topic is about how you utilize your LMS, right? And so because I believe reflection is so critical to ensuring student success, I wanted to think about some ways that your LMS can be that component to help with offering your students opportunities for reflection. So these are just a few examples of how you might utilize different components of a learning management system. So specifically at Da Vinci, we talk about Leo as a way to to do a lot of these things. And so whether it is a written assignment, and so like actually assigning your students those opportunities to reflect on their learning. And so giving them a literal written assignment and, asking them those reflective type questions, like for a service learning example that I gave earlier, you might even utilize some of those same types of questions. Describe your experience, describe the significance of the experience. What are your next steps? Those types of things. Whether discussion boards, another great way to utilize your LMS when it comes to reflection, because students are engaging in it. When you're engaging in a discussion and there's this back and forth between participants, whether it's back and forth between students and faculty, or students and other students, or students and faculty, engaging in that discussion is going to encourage your students to be reflective and to really critically think about what they want to say and why they want to say that. And so moving on from discussions, we get to these this idea of evaluations. And so one of my favorite ideas is utilizing self-evaluations. And so having students evaluate themselves based upon, whether it's their learning or their performance. For example, if they, were to see a standardized patient in a medical education program, have them evaluate themselves. I know multiple institutions who utilize, really great rubrics as tools to evaluate their students. And I think, taking those same rubrics that faculty are completing and having the students evaluate themselves using those same tools, I think is a great way to have students really, reflect on, enter into some of those metacognitive strategies that I talked about earlier. And then there's lots of other opportunities within Leo, for example, with the academic portrait. It's a great place that students can go and get feedback, which we're coming to soon. But once they get that feedback, that's a place that they can really sit and reflect on not just, a specific component of their academic career, but they can kind of see a portrait, a full view of their academic career and reflect on, different stages, maybe their didactic years. And then once they move on to their clerkship years, maybe they've gained some new understanding and maybe started to employ different strategies. Even between years 1 and years 2 of many medical programs, there's a lot of student growth when it comes to how they prepare for exams, how they study, how they learn. And so I also have to give a plug for Flipgrid, one of my favorite free learning tools that it's out there. It's embeddable in your learning management system, and in Leo specifically, I know it will embed in events and in course screens. And so it's a great place to encourage not just discussion, but video discussion. And so students are engaging in that discussion via Flipgrid. And so they're, responding and working with each other to maybe answer a problem and think critically about something within your curriculum. So your LMS is a great tool that you can use to really encourage those reflective practices. And I also want to add this, idea that it's not just for students. Faculty can complete self-evaluations just like students can. And so I know for myself, when I was in a teacher education program, we were really encouraged to think about and to employ reflective strategies in our teaching. And so, after each lesson that we taught or each lecture that we gave, we were really encouraged to be very reflective and think about what went well, what could we do differently? Did the students learn the material, or was I just standing up there talking for, 40 or 50 minutes? So that reflective piece is important, not just for students, but also for faculty. And your LMS can support that. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to mention feedback as the other critical element here, because without good feedback, students don't really have the opportunities to reflect. And so there are a couple things I want to mention about feedback. First of all, feedback should be as timely as possible. And so, giving students timely feedback as soon as possible after the learning has occurred is going to allow those students to really employ those metacognitive strategies, because if they don't get feedback for a few weeks, and if the learning happens and they're assessed on the learning and then they get feedback 2 or 3 weeks later, then at that point they've really moved on, and they're working on juggling a lot of, especially in medical education, they're juggling a lot all at once, and so they might not be able to recall what strategies they were utilizing at that time. So definitely timely feedback, specific feedback. And so, again, not just providing generic, great job, what about it was good? What about it could they improve? And providing as specific feedback as possible, and then making that feedback personal. So it's not just about, what is expected, but what is expected of that student specifically. And so, again, thinking about, from a practical standpoint, how you utilize your LMS to provide feedback. Are you using comments in the gradebook? Are you actively engaging with students in discussions? So I mentioned discussions earlier as a way for students to reflect, but it's also a way for faculty to engage. And so, I definitely would encourage you to not let the discussion boards be for students to sit and talk to each other and, get the checkbox that yes, they responded and they participated, but that you actively engage them as faculty and think about ways that you can extend the discussion. So, responding to a student's answer and saying, hey, that's a really good observation, but what if XYZ was different, then what would you say? And so, really taking, encouraging them to apply what they've learned to other situations, I think is a great way for them to reflect on what they've learned and then apply it in new situations. So again, evaluations, I think, are helpful for feedback as well, whether it's a peer evaluation or evaluation of the students by faculty. That's a great place for you to provide that specific feedback that we talked about. Utilizing comment boxes. I know in evaluation forms, we often have like the Likert scale questions, strongly disagree to strongly agree, something like that. But then, there's always the comment section, right below those questions. And I really encourage you to utilize those comments, even when, the students are getting perfect scores and they're doing excellent, utilize the comments to let the students know what was so, not just that they did perfect, but like what really stood out in your mind as the evaluator. And then especially whenever they're not getting those perfect scores, what specifically can they do to improve? And so that feedback, again, in Leo, the academic portrait is a great place for students to go and retrieve that feedback. Formative assessment, you see that here on the screen. That is, in my mind, one of the keys to providing, feedback in a timely manner for students, right? So whether it's a quiz in class or a specific type of learning content that students are engaging in, are they having the opportunity to formatively assess themselves and be formatively assessed by faculty as well? And then finally, team-based learning. For those of you not familiar with team-based learning, it's this idea that students are going to work together in teams to solve problems. And one component that you often see of that are what's called a group readiness assessment test, or GRAT, sometimes called a TRAT for team readiness assessment. And within those, oftentimes you'll see students utilizing what I would call a scratch-off card. And so they have this, physical card that they can scratch off to see, did they get the answer right to a question. And so as they scratch off, answer A, there might be a smiley face under there and say, oh, we got this one right. Or if A is incorrect, they might see a frowny face, for example. And so it gives them immediate feedback on their responses. And so what's great with Leo is that we provide the digital versions of those scratch-off cards so that they can do team-based learning right within their LMS. So I think, I would encourage you to think about ways that you can provide feedback and opportunities for reflection within your LMS as you're preparing for a new academic year. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about communication with your students. So in order to ensure student success, part of that is actually making sure students have the proper expectations, that they are aware of what they need to be learning or doing or submitting for assignments. I often hear people say that you cannot over communicate with your students. You might feel like you're sending way too many announcements and that students are getting tired of all of these emails from their professor. Trust me, that's way better than under communicating. And so, consider ways that you're going to utilize your LMS to send announcements and reminders to your students. Make sure that they are getting these things in their inbox and that they are aware of what is expected of them, where they're expected to be, at what time. I know in Leo, we allow you to utilize when you go into an individual event in Leo, students can, there's a description area. So faculty can provide information about that event, what's going to happen. And I know some faculty that actually utilize that field and they will map out an entire hour. So if the class happens from 9 o'clock to 9:50 a.m., then this instructor is going to say from 9 to 9:10, we're going to be doing this. From 9:15 to 9:25, we're going to be taking a group readiness assessment test. And then for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be engaging in application exercises. Students really know what to expect before they even show up. They know what's going to happen. And so, again, you can't over communicate with your students. So be aware of ways that you can leverage your LMS to communicate effectively with your students. And then kind of wrapping up a little bit, thinking about how do your students access the learning content? What is the role your LMS plays in providing that access to them? So whether it's accessing documents, digital versions of documents like slide decks or PDFs, even just like handouts or topical list of exam topics to study, all kinds of things like that. Are they accessing recorded lectures through your LMS, whether it's through a third-party tool or whether you're just providing a link to a video or even uploading video files within your LMS? How are you providing access to that material? Live lectures, where do they need to be and when? I know live lectures aren't as common in these days of pandemics, but given a live lecture, students oftentimes want to know, exactly where to be and when. I know many campuses out there, students are, with multiple programs and things going on a health sciences campus, lectures may not always be in the same place at the same time. If students are working in small groups, they might be, moving from conference room to conference room to work and engage with those small group activities. So, making sure that you can utilize your LMS to ensure students know where to be. And what's great about Leo is that it's very calendar based. When students log on, the first thing they see is a calendar, so they can click on an event and know exactly where to be. And they can access that learning material right alongside that event. Even on the home page, they can see those materials available for that event. So going back to that first bubble there. And then the last thing I wanted to mention with regards to e-learning content. And so this is something we're seeing more and more, are that institutions are providing e-learning content. And so what I mean by e-learning content are basically the kind of like interactive experiences for students. And so these are usually built using third-party authoring tools, but it's a way that you can make that learning experience a bit more engaging. So think of like PowerPoint maybe on steroids. They don't move through it in a linear fashion. It's more of, they learn at their own pace and they can branch off into different directions if they want to. They can engage with like scenario-based activities. And so students, would choose their response given a scenario, and they're taken to, kind of what happened after they chose that response. So there's a lot of ways that you can utilize e-learning content or SCORM content right within many LMSs. I know Leo supports SCORM content and even allows, if you were to build a quiz, say, into that e-learning content, you can take those scores from the quiz and plug them right into the gradebook from within your LMS. So, think about how you utilize your LMS to leverage access to content, as well as providing opportunities for feedback and reflection and communicating with students as well. And so just kind of wrapping up as a primer for next week, I want to encourage you to think about the role learning objectives play in helping your students to be successful. Not only when it comes to planning for faculty and like determining what you're teaching and how you're going to teach it, but also so that students again are aware of expectations and so that you're aware and ensuring that what you're teaching aligns with that overall strategy at your institution. So I know Dan is going to be talking a little bit more about learning objectives next week with regards to preparing your courses in your LMS. So with that, I do want to kind of stop. We're getting close to time, and I know we want to take some questions. So if anybody has any questions, Dan, not sure if we had any questions come in, but I'm definitely excited to hear what you guys had to say.
Yeah, Austin, we actually do have a couple questions, and if anybody does have questions during this time, feel free to throw them into that Q&A, and I'll make sure that we get to them before we run out of time today. If we don't, well, Austin or myself will make sure we reach out to you. So first and foremost, question number one came from earlier. I'm sorry, I should have probably interrupted you during this time. Students, can you just explain very briefly, since we're running out of time, that students can actually do self-evaluation in Leo? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there is a tool in Leo for students to evaluate themselves. So you can build an evaluation form and assign that for students to complete. In fact, you could utilize, even if it's the same form that you're using, I think of standardized patients as a great example of this. Oftentimes you might use an evaluation form to evaluate students as they, a clinical faculty member would fill out this form as a student is encountering this standardized patient. And, I would encourage you to take that exact same form and assign it to the students as a self-evaluation and have them complete that so that, they're able to kind of assess themselves even before they get the feedback from the faculty member. I think that's a very powerful approach to seeing, what the students thought about it, but also getting that, more professional feedback from the faculty member.
Very cool. Thank you. Another question we have, kind of piggybacking off that, Austin, is what is the student-teacher ratio you were considering with these suggestions, especially for giving personal feedback?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So when it comes to, I know in many medical education programs, you might have really large classes, right? And so I know there's oftentimes, though, at least in the programs I've worked with, they employ the use of student advisors. And so that's a perfect opportunity for advisors to, to engage with those students. And I mentioned academic portrait. What's great about that is that advisors have access to the academic portrait and they can see their students and they can see their students' academic history as well as evaluations of their students. And so that's a much easier way to kind of narrow that gap with regards to large numbers of faculty providing feedback. And again, working in small groups. I know small groups is a big focus in many medical education programs today, so that students are working in groups of 6 to 8 and working with a facilitator in a problem-based learning scenario, or those types of scenarios are really going to make that opportunity for specific feedback to work. I definitely understand when you're working with classes of 100 to 200 students, you may not have the opportunity to provide as much personal feedback. But when available, I definitely think we should take advantage of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Austin. Let's try and sneak in one more. And for those of you that aren't getting your questions answered, we will reach out to you. You mentioned like automated like updates or messaging. Can you do that in Leo? Can you, as far as like when you're talking about communication?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways that Leo will automate reminders for, evaluations, for example. You can set up a schedule for those reminders to go out. We talked a little bit about that in our last webinar with some of the folks from SUNY and OSU, and how those reminders can actually increase completion rates for evaluations, for like course evaluations, for example, as well as sending out notifications within the system about assignments that have been assignments that have been assigned to students to complete. So there are a number of ways that Leo kind of helps with that process.
Very cool. Thank you for that. So we're right at time now. So thank you for being so mindful of time today, Austin. I know that can be really difficult, especially since we're doing some condensed webinars. We wanted to thank everyone's participation and attendance today. Of course, it's always appreciated, and we're happy to have you. Next week, we are going to continue the Lunch with Leo series, and we will make sure that we send out more information on that with a registration link as well. So again, thank you everyone, and have a terrific day.